Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Sloan, the Content and Communications Manager here at Knotch. I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us and welcome you to Knotch and Mindshare's Publisher Roundtable on how brands can stay relevant through content. So just a bit of housekeeping. I wanted to note that this roundtable conversation is 100% off the record, just so we can all learn from each other and be transparent with one another as we grow. And additionally, as we get ready to hear from our amazing lineup of panelists, I would just encourage you to submit any questions you have for them using the Q&A box that Knotch has that you should see on the bottom of your screen. So our hosts today will be just taking some time to go through these and shoot them over to our guests. So make sure you get those in. And now I'd like to introduce our hosts, Andrew Bolton and David Lang, as they lead us through this discussion with panelists from some of the top publishers to discuss the role of content during these times. So our first host is Andrew Bolton, the SVP of Partnerships at Knotch, a content intelligence platform that enables companies like Amazon, Facebook, Walmart, Bank of America, Salesforce, and others to plan for breakthrough content, as well as measure and optimize it across channels. Bolton oversees all of Knotch's client partnerships and works with clients to evangelize the value of content. And prior to joining the marketing world, he was actually on the US rowing team and was also a member of the 2008 Olympic team. And we also have David Lang today. He is the Chief Content Officer at Mindshare, a global media agency network and one of the world's largest media agencies. Lang oversees all creative development and production, strategic marketing, and partnerships in the entertainment marketing arena, as well as focuses on the creation of new economic models. Lang has been honored as a Media All-Star and Media Maven, named to Ad Age's Entertainment A-List, and honored as the Content Innovator of the Year by the Content Council. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ryan. And thank you to everyone for joining. I don't have nearly as many professional accolades as David, so I had to throw in at least one somewhat interesting tidbit about my life before all things digital marketing. So sorry if I one-upped you.
I would like to ask just a little bit about the Olympic team, please, because that is something we did not know.
Yes, it was a very long time ago. It was in 2008, and I can say that I have a special place in my heart and commiserate with all the athletes that were supposed to be competing, in about a month or so in Japan that now have to wait a whole other year, knowing how neurotic athletes are, myself included. I couldn't even imagine just what was going through your head where you're like, you got a date, you're ready to go, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, whole next year. So if you know any Olympic athletes out there, if you're at companies that support Olympic athletes, kudos, check in with them. You'll be cheering them on hopefully in a year. So anyways, back to the task at hand. I want to welcome all of our speakers. We've got a really robust panel here. We've got a great audience of people joining. I think we're up to almost 182 folks who have joined so far, which is great. And the reason we're all here is to really talk about content and specifically the role of content in times like these. I think one thing that we've heard from our clients on the Knotch side is that people know that content's like the best, most important way to reach consumers during a crisis, and that's been reinforced by a lot of content teams that are internal at brands, really cranking up their own content machines and just publishing and putting things out in the world. But I think along with that, we've heard on the publisher, kind of the branded custom content side of things, that there was a bit of a pause because brands wanted to make sure that the content was going to market was going to resonate and be empathetic and not be tone deaf. And I think now that we're kind of getting used to what this environment is like, there are a lot of questions that are coming from brands around how do I best leverage publisher partners to reach those audiences? How do I get my message out? How do I do it through spreading a brand message of positivity or utility to all these people that are homebound. And so I think there's going to be a really interesting conversation, and I'm really excited to hear what all these great folks have to say.
Well, Andrew, it's a bizarre new normal we're living through, but I think it's not just about branded content and publisher content. It's about how advertisers, if they should, and then how they should create content at a time like this. as chief content officer of Mindshare, it's kind of self-serving to go, yeah, well, of course they should be creating content, right? But I think if you look historically for the answers, you'll find them, and it's pretty clear. All the way back, like from the Great Depression, 1927, Harvard Business Review published results that demonstrated that companies that increased their ad budgets during a recession grew sales much faster than their rivals, not only during the downturn, but also afterwards. And those that decreased advertising lost market share after the Depression. And then if you move forward, let's say to 2008, Millward Brown showed evidence that 60% of brands that went dark during the economic downturn, and that was defined, by the way, as a no TV ad spend for 6 months, they saw brand use decrease by like 24% and brand image by 28% by consumers. Now, brands that cut their ad budget at a higher rate relative to their competitors were obviously at a greater risk for share loss. But you know, the examples of this kind of stuff are aplenty and all over the place. And you can argue the pandemic is totally different than a recession or worse. And I would completely agree. So let's look now at the past few weeks in some of the data. And I think all the publishers will most definitely talk about this as well. You know, Mindshare puts out a weekly research paper on how and what Americans are feeling. So let's go to the stuff that's obvious. Each week, Americans are more stressed, worried, anxious, frustrated, and scared. That's a duh, right? We would all guess that. Searches are up, streaming's up, videos up, binging's up, listening to music, all up. Got it. But what's really interesting is 89% of Americans think it's really going to take a community effort to stop the coronavirus. So 89% community effort. And what does that mean? And then how does it affect brands? And how do they feel about brands? In our polling, 70% of Americans want brands to tell them how they're taking action against the coronavirus. So let's be clear, this is not about selling product. It's not about advertising. It's what the brands are doing to help the problem. So since fewer brands are in the marketplace, share of voice is higher. And if you do it right, the impact can be greater. So brands obviously can do better long-term because they're saying the right thing and making the right impact when consumers and Americans are at a very emotional time. So our NeuroLab did some quick research that clearly shows consumers remember ads when they're in a heightened emotional state. And obviously we're all in a heightened emotional state, so the impact can be great. So I kind of wanted to set the table a bit because as we talk about publishers, I wouldn't want anybody to think this is about, hey, spend your money with publishers so we can go sell product. This is about helping communities across America, helping people, helping human beings, help the people on the front lines and helping consumers with their lives, and how we as creators and publishers can do that all together. And that's why we have this great group of people together today. So I'm going to kick it off and talk to Josh. But first, Andrew, you're going to set some ground rules just very briefly.
Yeah, just quick rules of the road, and Ryan mentioned this again. You know, we asked the audience. This is all off the record. As far as the format, each one of the panelists, we're going to ask questions to 5 to 7 minutes or so to respond. We're also going to be keeping a sharp eye on the Q&A button. So for those of you who have joined, and we're up to about 230 right now, which is great. If you want to ask a question to the panel, feel free to please put it into the Q&A, and we'll be getting those and addressing those along the way. And yeah, other than that, I hope this is really informative, and we're looking forward to this chat. So David, you want to introduce the poll and then take it away with Josh?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, the poll, and we would love your everybody's perspective on it. So take your brand hats off, take your advertising hats off. As a consumer, everybody, here's a question. What are you looking for most from a brand or an advertiser if they are going to create a creative asset? Creative asset, call it what you want, content advertising, a creative asset. Number 1, empathy. Number 2, utility. And number 3, a donation.
Cool. And technology willing, that should be popping up in everyone's face in a second here if it hasn't already. Cool. All right, why don't you take it away with Josh, dude?
Okay, so Josh Stinchcomb is an old buddy. We have worked together more than a few times, and more than that, he's a good egg. He is currently Chief Revenue Officer at Wall Street Journal Barron's Group, where he oversees advertising and marketing. Josh, sorry, I'm reading a little from your bio.
Okay.
Prior to this role, you've held numerous positions at Condé Nast, including SVP Corporate Sales, Publisher of Digital, and most recently Chief Experience Officer, where you oversaw content, experiential, and licensing, and that is where you and I cross paths most often. I am answering my poll. Okay, so first of all, Josh, let's go with the context of how we set it up at the beginning. Do you agree or disagree with the historical context and that brands should be playing in the space today in some sort of higher order way?
Yeah, well, look, I think, you referenced studies from past crises, and it's pretty unequivocal that brands that invest during a crisis tend to do better than brands that don't. Every dollar buys more share of voice, but there's also, I think, a hunger, a heightened sensitivity maybe among consumers for brand messages. Now that's sort of step one, which is there is opportunity, but how you do it is obviously equally, if not more important. And I also think this particular crisis has an added element of the health, scare, which I think is a little bit different than a pure sort of financial crisis. So I think while the historical data is directional and suggests investment, you do have to look at this one in particular. And I was interested to hear some of the research you guys have done, more recently specific to coronavirus, about what consumers want. And I saw something from Kantar too, that they came out with just last week, 35,000 consumers, and only 8% said they thought it was inappropriate for brands to be advertising during this period. So I think there is permission from consumers to advertise or to message. Maybe the word advertisement's wrong in the context of this conversation. And the conversation is really then, what am I saying? How am I saying it? And that's what's interesting to explore, I think.
Yeah. So from your perspective, because you're, in part at a news outlet, right? The Journal. How are you a resource for brand partners? And what does that really look like? And how is it different than if you're just, not at a news organization or a news outlet?
Yeah, well, I think being a news outlet and one that's been covering this extensively and from a lot of different angles, I think we have information and access to information that's helpful to people, consumers, but also to brands. And so bringing that insight directly to our marketing partners is one way that we're helping. So I'd put that in the sort of inform bucket. We launched a couple of weeks ago a sort of a weekly editor-marketer conference call where we had the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, then the editor of Barron's on a separate call, talking about how they're covering it, what they're hearing. The Barron's one was obviously more financially focused. I actually just did one about an hour ago with Jim Spiros, who was a former CMO of Fidelity, who sort of famously launched a huge campaign during the last financial crisis and sort of getting his point of view. So I think all publishers can play the role of informing their brand partners, and that's a very important role to play. Maybe the most important. Being a news outlet, I would say we have the added, capability of providing a depth of insight or information around the issue itself, which is true of some of the other folks on this call as well. Yeah. So that's kind of bucket one is information. I think the second thing is arming publishers with sort of capabilities to help them do what they need to do. So our content division, which is called The Trust, is putting together a white paper that will be out, I think, tomorrow, and I'm happy to share it with the folks on the call if there's a way to do that. That is basically looking at the landscape of who's messaging, how are they messaging, and sort of putting it into buckets, to try to make sense of the different approaches and sort of what's ringing true and what's not. And so, and then, being available to consult if that's what it is, or help co-create if that's what the right thing is. So, I think like many of the folks on this call, we have those kinds of capabilities, but, really focusing them now on, what's going on in the world and sort of applying them to that context. And then the last thing I'd say, and this is, maybe more tactical, but equally important, is so inform, arm or create with, and then how do we augment or facilitate spend? Because, if you decide you're going to be in market, you have to decide then how you're going to be in market. And then you may have constraints on budget, in the short term, or uncertainty in budget. And we know advertising, as a discretionary spend in many instances can be at risk of being cut during a time like this. And so we need to help arm marketers to make a case to their CFOs or CEOs, if that's the right thing, for investment during this period. And what we're trying to do at the Journal, and I've seen a ton of initiatives from other publishers to the same end, is make it easier to invest with confidence. So we just rolled out a guarantee on all print advertising, a recall guarantee, as a way to add value to investment. Deferring payment terms, those kinds of things. We have to recognize, we're in this for the long haul. And so how can we be a good partner and make it, just sort of tactically easier to spend?
Yep. Well, you brought up something earlier, which I think is important. There's the why and there's the how, right? And the why is kind of there, and the data tells you it's better to be in play in the right way, but then the right way is the how. We've outlined like a whole strategic lens for clients to look at. And we've kind of built this value exchange, whether it's functional, meaning relief, information, news, entertainment, i.e. distraction, and then donation. From your standpoint, do you see any category can play in any of those 4 buckets, or are certain categories or verticals given more permission by consumers because they're in a certain category?
Yeah, I don't think there's sort of total carte blanche depending on your sector. I mean, the sort of overused term of authenticity is incredibly important right now. Like, where do you have permission to go with your messaging? And I think that does depend to some degree on what kind of a product or service you are. That's not to say there's only one path for any given sector, but I think there are some paths that make more sense for certain sectors, right? And you think about, you guys had introduced this idea of utility or empathy or donation, or those kind of, which of those are the sort of what people want to hear? And I think the answer is it depends from whom, right? So I look at what's out in the market. Verizon's out there saying we're here for you. Here's what we're doing to fortify our network. So first responders have access to our tools, as do consumers. Like, that's a very helpful, important message. It's one of utility to some degree, and it makes sense given what they do. I look at other folks like Coke and McDonald's who have said, basically, we're not going to advertise, we're going to donate money. So sort of the donation route. And I think even who they are, that probably makes sense, but they're creative too. Like, and I saw this, I think this was in Brazil, like McDonald's, like, separated their arches at the restaurant or something to like represent sort of, social distancing or whatever. So I think you can be creative, even in delivering a sort of a donation message. On the empathy front, you hear a lot about CEOs taking pay cuts and kind of messaging that. And I think that shows a sign of solidarity with a lot of people who are out of work. So, and I'll take an extreme example. I think some products, take like Clorox, the fact that it kills 99.9% of germs or whatever it is, that's a relevant message right now. That's their sort of normal product message. So, it doesn't all have to be kind of PSA-y. It can be product attribute in some instances, but it depends who you are, right? It's like, is it authentic? Is it relevant? And then is it being delivered in a humble way? I think that's the other thing. And that's like less about message and more about tone, but equally important.
Yeah, one of the things that we always find is that, and that's why we actually position the poll question as a consumer, and because we're all industry people, on this panel and in this webinar, and a lot of times we don't take that hat off when we think, especially from the industry side. And I think it's really important, to think as a consumer from, like you just said, the tone. It's not just the message, but it's how you're saying it, and then what the message is. One last quick question, and then we're going to kick it back to Andrew, who's going to talk to Hayley Romer of The Atlantic. Is there any insight that you guys have uncovered in the past few weeks that has been surprising or unexpected on the consumer data front?
On the consumer data front, I mean, yeah, I guess not surprisingly, like many news outlets, we're seeing a huge surge in traffic. And, I think we have a lot of more markets-focused content, especially with Barron's and MarketWatch. So there's a huge appetite for sort of the impact on not only the economy broadly for people's businesses, but their personal finances. And so, we've done a lot more kind of service content around that front. So not sort of overly surprising there, to be honest. I think what has sort of struck me is, because people are like, oh, what should we do, during this period? How should we behave as marketers together? How should we be working together? And, for better or worse, the answer is kind of like really the way you should be operating generally, even outside of a crisis, which is, are you thinking about building trust with your brand? Are you thinking about the utility of your brand? I think if you've done that up until this point, you're going to be better off. And then it's about flexibility. We've sort of stopped 3 or 4 branded content projects in midstream and said, we can't continue to create what we were going to create. That just makes no sense.
Yeah.
So let's just totally let's scrap it and re-report. And even at the expense of our margin, certainly in the short term, because like I said, everyone is taking that hit. You've got to do that. The other thing I think is interesting and will be sort of a good thing coming out of here is people are going to get, I think, sort of more diversified in the formats they use. So if you can't do shoots right now, we do more animation or virtual conferences. So different kinds of formats you're going to be forced into right now, actually, I think will be a welcome mix. And so being flexible, being prepared to change tracks, et cetera. I bet in the end, when we come out of this, the kinds of deals that we'll do together with brands will be more frameworks with like flexibility for where we go versus like these are the topics and this is the rollout, and that kind of like certainty will feel like crazy, given what we've just been through. And that's probably a good outcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you, my friend. Stay safe, and most importantly, stay healthy.
Thank you too.
Andrew, we'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Josh. Very insightful, and appreciate you kicking us off. So next we have Hayley from The Atlantic, and I will read through your illustrious bio here. So Hayley is the Chief Revenue Officer and Publisher at The Atlantic. Under her leadership, The Atlantic and The Atlantic Rethink have become the leader in native advertising for the industry in both 2016 and 2017. Atlantic Rethink was named Content Best in-House Content Studio by Digiday. Hayley has been named one of Ad Age's 40 Under 40 and Folio's top women in media. So thank you for joining us, Hayley.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. So my question, actually, it's funny, it stems from a comment. We did a roundtable last week with a bunch of CEOs, and we had Kristen Lemkow on, and always dropping great bits of knowledge and ways of thinking about things. And she had an interesting point that, this crisis is a bit of a combination of 9/11 and 2008, where there's this existential well-being threat, as well as the financial threat. And so there are a lot of landmines out there to try to avoid as a brand. And I think that one of the biggest things that we've been hearing is people want to, this idea of being tone deaf, and how do you avoid that? So just wanted to get your thoughts on how brands can avoid being tone deaf with content. And specifically, actually, this is a nice segue with a question that came in through the chat here, which is, the conversation is going to shift to how do we open up the economy at some point. And so how do companies convey the need to do that without appearing tone deaf and appearing insensitive, because it's going to become economic at some point?
Yeah, that's it's interesting, and it's certainly, I think that question is, there's no shortage of that question being asked. I think we're all kind of dealing with the same issues right now, one of which is really that. I mean, there's no way. You started out, or David started out, by comparing this to the 2008 financial crisis. And I think it's useful to look at historical context always, but the reality is that's not going to tell you exactly what's going to happen here. They're not the same, we're not in the same moment. The crises are not exactly the same. The impact, the sort of cause and effects are not the same. So it's useful as a bit of a guide, or at least if nothing else, it's useful to understand that we will make it through. It's always useful to look at past crises to understand that inevitably we will come out of them. But I don't know that you can draw an exact parallel to say how we will come out of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I agree with everything that Josh said. What brands are trying to do is figure out how to be relevant in the moment. And there are different frames through which you can think about it. The thing that we've been thinking about most at The Atlantic, and the thing that I implore upon my team and talk to our partners about more than anything else, is meaning and being meaningful. And so there's everything layered into that. There is the notion of authenticity and obviously being true to who you are. There's the notion of value. There's potentially utility, donation, but whatever it is, make sure that you are creating meaning in this moment. I mean, that's what this moment calls for. And what we try to do, we've got obviously an extensive history at The Atlantic. We're about 163 years old, or just about to hit 163. So again, it's useful to draw on history for comparison's sake, or for some context. But what we try to do is really deeply understand how we can be our best selves. At what point in time should we pull this lever or that lever? Or how do we make sure that we are as meaningful as possible in this moment? And that's equally true on the editorial side as it is for the business side. And I think the same has to be true for brands. I mean, it always does start with your relevance and knowing who you are. But again, if you want to make meaning in this moment, you need to think about, obviously, the notion of being tone deaf and what people care about. Somebody said something earlier in a conversation I was in, about how this is a true listening moment, and listening with the intention of listening as opposed to listening with the intention of answering. And I think that's something that's also pretty unique to this moment. I mean, never before have we in our careers been given full license to ostensibly pause and put into perspective what it is we're dealing with and how we do deal with it, right? So it's a gift of sorts, because if you can really listen to everybody in this moment, draw from historical context, and then hit pause and say, okay, so where do I go from here and what do I do with this? You can ultimately create meaning and do something on behalf of your brand and yourself that you might not otherwise have been able to, in all likelihood, wouldn't have been able to. You're gonna have to say hello if you're gonna poke your head in. That's my 8-year-old, Adler. Yeah, that happens to me all day, every day. Usually it's the little one.
I mean, I remember a time that was like news. Remember, like, I forget, it was like some diplomat in some place, and his kids like came in like while he was being interviewed by, and people, that was like a meme for weeks. And now that's just, the life that we live in. So
they bring so much joy, and it's great. Actually, I kind of love it. I'm gonna miss that.
Yeah, for sure. Lots of extra parenting time, for sure. I like this idea you were talking about meaning. I think that one interesting thing is for publishers such as yourself, you work with a pretty broad, diverse group of clients across different industries. Like, do you see like some that are really aligning around like swim lanes as far as like the meaning for that industry? Or do you see people kind of being able to spread across those and being a little bit more of a chameleon depending upon like where they want to fit in from their messaging?
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't been asked that. Haven't answered that exact question before, but I think what I'm seeing is people thinking about the customer as opposed to the industry, which is kind of nice. On the one hand, if somebody's in financial services, for example, they're not going to speak about something that is totally irrelevant to them, but they are thinking about the individual, the end user in that moment, as opposed to, a sort of specific demographic or the product that they're pushing. And so actually the force to humanize your brand is really good. I do want to point out one thing, though, that I think is totally different from any other crisis that we might have gotten into with respect to brands. The conversation around brand purpose and the conversation around brand purpose has been louder, or was brought to the forefront of brand marketing and thinking about content marketing before this crisis happened. So I actually think that brands are in a much more advantageous advantageous spot than they would have been otherwise. The push toward thinking about stakeholder value as opposed to shareholder value is one that has, given a huge inertia to brands to be able to come out and say things like, "We are here for you." For example, Verizon had talked a little bit about had kind of layered in some of their purpose-driven messaging before they got to this moment. And so you would envision that they would be able to come out and say something, "We are here for you," authentically, or that it probably took them a lot less time to think of that, sort of tagline or that message than it might have in any other point in time when people are sort of scrambling to say, "Oh no, what is it we say? How do we add value to people's lives in the moment?" They're already thinking about purpose. You mentioned Kristen Lenkow. And in Jamie Dimon's shareholder letter, he ended it by talking about the value to stakeholders. And I don't think ever before has a CEO of any organization come out without actually giving that specific message about stakeholders. You've had Larry Fink and other people come out recently talking about it, but in the context of their annual shareholder letter, making explicitly clear that you do have a responsibility to stakeholders really does give license to brand marketers to be able to tell the story or connect with consumers in a much more authentic, meaningful way, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think there's been a lot of ripple effects from the BlackRock and kind of the way that they've put things out in the world. And I think that it kind of got people's gears turning around this before this. And I think that it's made people view the value of brand purpose much elevated in the organization, which I think is good all around. It gets away from the bottom line buck. So thank you. That's really great insight, and really appreciate the feedback. I'm going to move over to Joy because I know she's got to run in a few minutes. I want to make sure she has time to speak. So our next guest here is Joy Robbins from the Washington Post. Quick background, Joy is a CRO where she oversees all aspects of advertising and plays a critical role in guiding teams to create the most effective solutions and programs for brand partners. Prior to the Post, Robbins served at Quartz as the Global Chief Revenue Officer. And you had several different positions at Quartz. I remember that's when I first met you, like years and years ago. So it's good to see you again.
Great to see you.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue from what Hayley was saying, but what are some of the brands and examples of brands that you see that are truly trying to make a difference and really thinking about that brand purpose, kind of this, I think of the content coming out now, and we've discussed this a little bit of kind of two buckets. There's the brand purpose, we're putting good vibes out into the world. And then there's the utility of hey, people are homebound. How do we provide that utility of keeping them entertained? How have you seen the brand purpose, kind of the upper funnel stuff, play out?
Yeah. I think what's interesting is there's a difference between it's closing, but initially you saw a gap between what brands were doing and what they were putting in as their voice when it came to creating content. You saw, and I think where we've seen really incredible watershed moments are the likes of LVMH, who came out very early on to talk about how they were going to change over to creating hand sanitizer. So that sort of rethinking that entire business model toward really helping society at large has been incredible. And then you saw partnerships that weren't necessarily ever, on anybody's radar between a brand like GE and Ford to come together to make ventilators. And so while that hasn't necessarily always made it into what we would maybe call paid content marketing, I think a lot of those have served as the foundations to really help these brands find what we would say, their voice in how to be appropriate when appearing next to types of content like this. So sort of some of those innovations that were coming out. Another area that we've seen really take center stage is how brands are really thinking about their employees at the time. We kind of bucket it as what brands are doing for society and humanity, what they're doing for their customers, and what they're doing for their employees. So we've seen brands take out, full page ads or do content around just how their pride in their employees, or publicly thanking their employees, or making it easier for their customers to access them online versus having to go into brick and mortar. So I think it is a mix of, what they're doing for humanity, and then ultimately that service-driven types of content. Those are the two things that we're seeing the most, and also that we're hearing from our readers that they want the most.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually a good segue to a question that just got asked through the chat from Luke from Autodesk. Basically, he's saying, curious how publishers are balancing traditional content with COVID-19 focused content. Are they pausing or delaying other coverage due to audience demand? Marketers are struggling with this balance and trying to figure out how much to pivot, pure COVID while keeping other campaigns going. How have you guys been approaching that?
Well, I mean, I think to completely not focus on it as a core of our coverage right now would be, not doing our jobs as making sure that we're informing the public. And what we've seen, there's what we call sort of first entry point, where we're seeing an explosion of readership to our COVID content. But also people are then, we call second click. They're looking then to understand the service-driven journalism for, things like our voraciously, our Epicurean content, things about our education and, how to balance working from home with homeschooling. So there's the very present, COVID and its implications, and then the more, things that are seeping into our lives more naturally. From a non-COVID related content, there's definitely still, we still see readership there, but we do see a really, really high both concentration of readership and reporting on the thing that's ultimately center stage in anybody's mind right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that no matter what you do, you kind of always get sucked into what's going on top of mind. Yeah. So I think that, whether that be the health aspect of it or the, I'm stuck at home, help me cook something better.
That's exactly right. That's right.
It really humanizes things. So I think that's really smart.
And we've been looking at week over week sort of trends in terms of our readership and where we've seen big increases in specific sections. And yes, we've seen tremendous growth in places like education, entertainment, Epicurean. But if you look a level deeper, you see that those are often stories that are, somehow intersecting with the implications of COVID.
Yep. And thank you for saying Epicurean, because I can say that maybe once and then I can never say it. It's a jumbled word. So, David, I saw you on mute. Did you have a question or something you want to jump in on?
No.
Okay, cool. I was just curious. I want to make sure you stay involved. Cool. Well, I think this has been really helpful. I actually am going to pitch it back over to David, who is going to talk to Katie from Quartz. And Joy, I know you got to run, but thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Really great insights, and looking forward to catching up more in the future.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. David, take it away.
All right, so Katie Manderfield is Global Executive Strategy Director at Bloomberg, formerly head of content strategy at T-Brand at New York Times, obviously award-winning. You worked for WPP's SJR, done a lot with brands like TED, Levi, Motion Picture Association of America, etc. Katie, welcome, first of all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And one of the things that I wanted to start off with, we're all talking about creating content. It's the right thing to do. Yet, and this came from the audience, the question is, why are so many advertisers cutting their ad budgets completely or pushing when the research shows how important it is to advertise? So let's tackle that one first.
Sure. I think obviously right now this is kind of a scary time for a lot of people, especially if you're thinking about sort of risk and, just thinking about sort of how brands show up. This isn't exactly the most risk-free sort of environment right now. And so I think for a lot of brands, they're just not sure how to react, because I think people don't want to look like they're being, I think it's as has been discussed here, opportunistic, or looking like they're exploiting the situation, because this is a scary time. And we're talking about, lives being lost. So I think there's a real concern here and something to keep in mind for brands on how to really, manage their storytelling, sort of delicately and really make sure that they're offering utility-driven solutions, making sure that they're actually, working to help advance innovation in this area versus, using it as a marketing opportunity that's a little bit tone deaf. So I think that's what we're seeing is just, making sure to help work with brands on figuring out what that sort of right message is so that they are part of the solution and not part of a problem in any way.
Right. So knowing where you sit, how do you manage the misinformation of data, sort through what's true and what's not?
Yeah, so that's obviously a huge, area of interest for us here at Bloomberg. Data is kind of core to everything that we do. And of course, we're not, a content aggregator. So most of our journalism is original reporting, making sure, that it's sourced from our proprietary data. And I think something that's, really of interest to us too is thinking about, the volatility of the markets and how that's really been sort of a crazy time. Our audience is super concerned with that. So where, our perspective is always that data leads. And that's something that we tell our advertising clients as well. That's, especially and more than ever in times like this, making sure that you have the facts right, making sure that things are triple checked. We have Bloomberg analysts who really help us make sure that even, all of our brand stories come from a place of proprietary data, knowledge, making sure we're not contributing to any obviously misinformation issues and making sure that everything is really, really kosher there.
Right. So with the volatility in the market, you said it, right? And it's hugely volatile every day.
Yeah.
So how do you think brands can really bring a sense of assurance and help consumers lessen their anxieties about the economy and what's going on?
I think the first step is really acknowledging that this is a scary time and that people's anxieties are, really high. And I think this is, uncharted waters. We've never seen something like this. So I think just coming from that place of vulnerability, that place of sort of understanding that that's where we're all at, I think for us, volatility is obviously hugely important, as I mentioned, and our audiences are really concerned about what's happening with the markets, and brands coming from a place of being empathetic to that and realizing that, don't sort of necessarily cash in on that or making any sort of messaging or marketing materials that add to that anxiety, but really saying, listen, we're here for you. This is a tough time for us all. And coming from that sort of human centric approach, I think is probably the best.
Right. It's interesting. You talk about always leading with data, but having a human-centric approach, which I couldn't agree with more. How is your news organization creating content that addresses those types of needs of consumers? And has it just been unbelievably accelerated? What is the cadence of all that, knowing how quick the news cycle is and how quickly the story, evolves on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think this is, sort of, as I said too, just such the real-time nature of this is really, incredible. Like, I don't think anyone has seen something of this nature and just how it's really affected everyone here on this panel, the publications we all work at, how important this type of coverage is, making sure that everything is coming from a place of data and making sure that everything is fact driven. I think, publishers obviously are sort of leading the way more than ever right now, just because, there is so much misinformation out there. We really need to make sure that the stories that are being told are factually accurate. And I think that's why, this is such if I was on the brand side, I would be really looking to make sure to partner with people who are in the business of really telling those fact-driven stories. So that message is obviously also what we tell our brands that we're working with to focus on, in the sense of just making sure that, everything is fact driven, and making sure we have double and triple assurances there.
And just one last question. Have you just seen a ton of brands course correcting their messaging from, let's say, 3 weeks ago to now? And is it more and more every week? Or do you think the first 2 weeks it was like, oh my God, we need to change our messaging, and now people have either pulled from the market or adjusted their messaging and it's calming down?
So I think there's been a variety of different situations sort of happening, but I think it's safe to say that everybody has completely changed how they're thinking about just marketing during this time and sort of what the role is of brands and of marketers. And, in how to be authentic right now. I think the truth is you just have to be authentic. There isn't trying to be authentic. There isn't, trying to have some sort of emotional appeal. It's like, it's really being there and actually being true to the nature of the situation and to the sensitivities that exist. So we saw, when this first happened, everyone sort of pausing, being like, I don't know what to do necessarily. And now I think what we're seeing is people being, and brands being like, okay, how do we be a part of the solution? How do we think about, really how to help where help is needed? You're seeing brands like Salesforce, dedicating masks. I think there are so many brands out there now who realize they can actually help in a meaningful way. And I think consumers are really looking, we're all looking for as much help as we can get right now, I think. So that's where sort of the trends that we've seen there.
Katie, thank you so much for joining the conversation. We really appreciate it. Let's go over to Armando. Where are you?
We're actually going to do a quick shift, David. We're actually going to do back-to-back Katie's. We're going to do Katie Weber because I know she's got to run in a little bit. So if you can take it away with her, that would be great.
I got no problem with that. So Katie,
on the fly.
not a problem. So Katie, over at Quartz, is the president of Quartz. You were previously the chief commercial officer at Quartz. But obviously now in your current role as president, it's been impressive. You've led the company to record growth of your subscription business and really transforming your overall advertising strategy. And by the way, congratulations are in order today. Katie was honored as Corporate Champion in the 2020 Folio Top Women in Media Awards. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Usually, like when we do team meetings, there's always this like silent round of applause because everyone's on mute, But
we can snap. We can do, yes, absolutely. So, we've covered a lot of ground. How do you at Quartz look at the current situation? What roles can brands play, and how can Quartz help?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. So, I think most on the line, specifically those that are in the news category, would agree it's quite a time to be a news publication right now. Mm-hmm. And I think at Quartz in particular, it really puts kind of a forced focus on how what we do, and everything from what we write to the video we produce to the newsletters we create to the events that we're putting on now virtually, making sure that everything is really built in service to our readers. And that's always been pretty core to Quartz, but I think this moment presents just a new level of need for that kind of mentality. And so it's been really great to see the newsroom kind of mobilize around that new dynamic, that new challenge, and question, everything and the purpose for doing it. And I think we've seen brands come to, I think, another way of thinking about this is like how to align with a publisher when thinking about which brands to work with. And I think this is true always, but particularly now, which is to look at the value proposition of that publisher. What are they for? How are they serving their audience? What are the expectations that their readers have when they're coming to their site? And do you as a brand fit? Do you have something to offer that is additive to that conversation? And I think for us, we've really been focused on, of course, first and foremost, vital information about the pandemic itself. So really just need to know information. But then from there, we've quickly, for example, in just 2 days, spun up a series of workshops that are now virtual, which are born out of our second brand, which is Quartz at Work. So it's Quartz at Work from home workshops. And these are, virtual events that are just bursting with compassion, addressing head on the personal impact of coronavirus and what a global work from home state really means. And so there, we're giving advice, inspiration, and I think productive human connection, which is another kind of need state of our audience. And then of course, ensuring that we are far less kind of breaking news, although of course there is need to know information right now, but making sure that we stay true to our own brand, which is to take a step back and help people to understand and interpret the medium and long-term implications of a moment like this so that they can be more productive in making better decisions for their business. And so through that lens, we're working really closely with brands to kind of do a similar audit of their own brand. And I think for us particularly, we have a lot of strength in B2B financial services, consultancies, helping them to look into themselves and find where they have real value to deliver. And I think this is not true for all categories, but in those categories, you know, you mentioned Kristen Lemkow and others. Jamie Dimon's very vocal right now. You know, there are people within these organizations that are true experts on subjects that are critical to understand right now. And there are also products that are given new meaning right now, and this has created new need for new products to allow business to continue. And so we're really focused on helping brands in those categories and others, but particularly in those are kind of the first movers, in making sure that they have the right environment and the right tone and the right products to message what it is that they have to offer that's actually additive.
Do you think it's easier, because you brought up B2B, is it easier for a B2B brand to play during this time?
I think it's potentially like a little bit easier to see the answer more quickly, but I don't think that there's no way to be creative about it. Josh referenced a couple of examples before that are not B2B, that are more creative. Kind of anecdotally, this is something that's really been interesting for us. We have an afternoon email. It's called the Daily Obsession, and it's this like super wonky, creative, witty, emoji-driven email that basically nerds out over one topic each day. So like bubble wrap, French fries, you know, kind of any random thing takes you down a rabbit hole, pulls you back out, and you leave kind of feeling like you've got some cocktail hour chatter. And we've actually seen that product, engagement with that product excel in this moment. And I think, you know, we jokingly say that people either want to read about bubble wrap or the need to know information and kind of nothing in between. But I think there is something to, you know, people have needs beyond just hard news, and they are looking for those surprise and delight moments. They are looking for ways to escape a little bit and kind of take a breath. And I think in that way, it opens up a lot of creative ways for non-B2B brands to be there in the right way.
Yeah, well, you know, you talk about just things outside the news and hardcore information. I read something the other day which made me laugh. Candy sales have never been higher, and alcohol sales through the roof. I mean, and you kind of get it. Okay, so here's a question for you. So we did the poll at the beginning, and I want you to tell me what you think won, and I'm going to tell everybody the results. So the question was, as a consumer, what are you looking for most from an advertiser if they're going to enter the marketplace? Number 1, empathy. Number 2, utility. Number 3, donation. What do you think was the front runner?
I think utility.
You're right, 60%. So 60% people said utility, 33% said empathy, and only 8% of the people listening, and that's 235 right now, said donation. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
I think a couple of things. I think one, people are, time is precious, right? And people are looking for information that offers value. And I think that utility is probably the front runner in that mix. I also, you know, another way of thinking about utility is just like, is this useful to me? And I think people are looking for a lot of answers right now. Everything from how can I be a working parent from home right now and still be on 8 hours of Zoom calls, you know, that, you know, guidance on that is useful, and its utility. And I think we've seen that we have a very vocal readership that writes to us all the time, and they've been saying to us that that's the thing that has been most helpful for them, is the usefulness of the content that we're producing in that way. And I think, you know, when you think about like all the brands that we all as consumers interact with all the time, the ones that you're most loyal to, the ones that you stick with, are the ones that are really there for you with usefulness in the moments that matter. And I think coming out of this, you'll see those kinds of relationships with consumers, for publishers and for brands, kind of re-cement themselves or form new bonds for those that have taken this approach and shown up in the right ways, offering utility.
I like the word usefulness, and thank you very much for joining us, and congratulations on the award.
Thank you so much.
Of course, of course.
Before our next speaker, actually, just one thing that popped in my head, and I apologize if this is a little tangential, but I'll open it up to anyone who wants to answer this. I think the donation question is actually a really interesting one, and to see how that's perceived. I think for me, when I see a brand making a donation, obviously that is great. I'm very happy that money is going somewhere, but I think there's always this weird disconnect of like, well, yeah, a donation's an easy thing to do. And whether it's $1 million or $50 million or $500,000, you're kind of like, is that a lot of money? Is that not a lot? Like, what's the scale of that? And I find it a little bit transactional, as opposed to having some more of like a mission behind it, or more of a cause. Does anyone else have that? Again, putting my consumer hat on, does anyone else kind of feel that, or have you heard that from other brands? Anyone who wants to chime in, feel free to unmute. Ben, maybe?
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in. I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with like people want to see platforms that will endure. So it's not just for this moment, but what is going to be in like short, medium, and long-term kind of focuses. And that's kind of the way that I've always thought about brand platforms. So you can see these like one-time donation things, but you want to know if that's ultimately going to last. And I think that that comes to your question of scale. You know, like, is that actually an amount of money that's going to be meaningful that goes on over the long term? And I don't know, as the creative, I'll probably come up with wildly creative answers, but it's kind of like a teach you to fish kind of moment. Like, if we're going to be community building, you can do something more than simply stepping in the moment and doing that. There's a lot of really creative answers that we can get there and do some really great stuff.
I also think it's how you tell that story about donation, you know, Andrew. It's kind of like, there's one thing to say, you know, we are giving $500,000 to X, and there's another thing to put it in context. You know, like if you look at what Ford did a couple of weeks ago, not only did they, you know, alter their lease plans and stuff for consumers who couldn't pay, they gave a lot of money to a local charity that they have been giving to for decades and decades and decades. So it's really about what they stand for, what they've always done, and what they're continuing to do. And yes, it's a donation, but then they talk about how it's literally helping lives on a daily basis. And then all of a sudden the donation becomes a human story. So I think it's all in how you tell that story.
I think it's linking those the two runners up to utility. Then the donation has to be combined with the empathy and that context for it to be 100%. Effective.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's actually a great transition, because I wanted to get to Armando Turco, and I want to talk to you about storytelling first and foremost. But first, let me tell the people who you are. You're SVP of Media Insights and Innovation at Vox. You've been in the marketing world for 20 years, and you've obviously developed many award-winning strategies. You've worked with brands such as PlayStation, Axe, Absolute, LG, and many more. So storytelling, what is the role of storytelling at this insane time that we are living through?
First of all, hi, it's good to see you, David, and good to be with everybody else. Minor correction, I'm the SVP of Content. I wish I were smart enough to be our SVP of Insights and Innovation. That's my friend Edwin Wong, who some of you may know. Yeah, storytelling. And like you said, very appropriate for the conversation that we've been having over the past few minutes, because actually we've been thinking a lot about storytelling, and we've introduced what we hope will be a really effective way to combine the empathy of storytelling with donations. I think donations is a bit of a reductive term, just to kind of go back to the previous question for a second, because I think it depends on what's the track record of the brand or the company, their philanthropic track record. I think what sort of proportion of your profits does that donation represent? I think how acute is the need? I think we're seeing a lot of communities that are very desperately and suddenly in need of donations. And so that's where we're focusing some of our efforts with a program that I'll talk about in a second. But as it regards storytelling in general, I think it's good to first, and this is sort of something that we've been contemplating ourselves, kind of ask ourselves what we mean by storytelling. Storytelling is one of those terms, like brand purpose, that in the past few years has become very much in vogue. but the more it's overused, the more diluted its meaning becomes.
Yep.
For instance, I think there's a role right now for the 60-second black and white montage of images of empty cities with heartfelt VO telling us that we're all going to be okay. There's a role for that in the media mix, but I'm not sure that I would call that storytelling, yet we see a lot of that in the mix, and a lot of people are very comforted by those messages from brands. But in particular, I think people want to hear from brands what they're doing right now, and this has been a recurring theme throughout the whole conversation. And in fact, we see some recent research saying that, like, while brands may fear that they will seem boastful or chest beady if they talk about some of the good work that they're doing right now and some of the impact that they're making, actually people are hungry for it. I think it gives them hope. I think it reflects well on the brand. And I think in general, they just want to sort of understand what companies are doing to generate progress. I think also, you know, the stories that we tell right now are not just the stories that will stick right now, but these are stories that people will be telling about our brands for a very long time. And so regardless of how you are currently spending or investing in media and distribution of those stories, it does feel like it's the right time for us to be documenting them.
Right.
And whether there's stories from inside your brand, you know, there's a ton of unsung heroes inside brands that are doing a lot of amazing work right now, whether that's the scientists that are applying engineering and artificial intelligence to try to find cures, or to try to analyze the data that will help us get to a cure, or even the cell tower operator that's ensuring that, like, we all remain connected, the frontline workers in healthcare, the teachers. So many companies right now are playing a really active part and making a really active contribution. And those are all really great stories to be told. And if not stories about the brand, then stories about people in the community that ultimately that brand caters to.
Right.
And so that's sort of where we're pointing a lot of our efforts. We have a team of investigative journalists. We call them story hunters. And we were just thinking about sort of how we could do our part, and started to ask ourselves if the act of storytelling in and of itself could become an act of doing good. And so we started something that we're calling a story drive, and we're talking to a number of brands about it right now, whereby we will sort of go inside your company or inside your community. We will find the stories of your employees or your partners or your stakeholders, and tell the stories of all the fascinating work that they're doing right now to provide relief to the people that need it most. If not, profile people that are benefiting from that good work. And then in essence, we'll publish those stories, and we'll direct a sizable portion of whatever investment, whatever budget the brand would have spent in distributing that content directly to either a charity that has an established or a fund that has an established relationship with the brand, or to the subject of the story themselves, in the case where it's somebody who, you know, maybe has a struggling small business and sort of needs some help in the short term getting back on their feet.
That's great.
We like sort of the idea of kind of storytelling becoming a service, but also putting a finer point on the type of stories that we tell, and making them very human, and maybe giving a face to a lot of the relief efforts that we read about in press releases.
Yeah. What are the trends you're seeing in content consumption on Vox, you know, whether, you know, from a macro and a micro level?
Yeah, I think from a macro level, in some ways, we're seeing an acceleration of trends that had already begun prior to the pandemic. For instance, we knew audio was going to be a thing. I think we've all known that for a while. And there have been some reports about actually a decline in podcasting listenership, but from our perspective across Vox Media Podcast Network, we're actually seeing pretty sizable increases during this time among our most popular shows and among our most popular networks, and that's creating a halo effect across some of the audio advertising that we've been producing. So that's sort of becoming an accelerant that I think we'll expect to continue well after things normalize, because we'll now have penetrated the audience that much more. Obviously, Vox's explanatory journalism, again, for a while we've known audiences are getting savvier. Actually, they really crave more context than they can get from the daily news headlines. They really want to understand what's going on around them. That too, I think provides an opportunity for brands to create that kind of content so that people understand sort of like what this all means in the long run. Traffic on Vox is seeing triple-digit growth across a number of different verticals, food-related content, of course, not just food-related content of the sort of service type and of the lifestyle type, like how to cook at home, but eaters' coverage of the restaurant industry. It's been really interesting to see how that sort of transcended insiders and has now kind of penetrated the consumer realm, and people are really taking really genuine interest in what's happening to the restaurant industry when we know that there's probably $5 to $7 billion economic hit that industry is going to take. And then I think on a more micro level, like everyone has been saying, what I'll call the kind of non-COVID content is seeing as much growth as the coronavirus related content, gaming content and recommendations and reviews on Polygon, streaming parties on Vulture, what to watch, what to stream, any content that I think is providing this service of relief to people who want to escape and still live pretty good lives inside their homes is doing quite well. But I think the more seismic sort of lasting effects we'll see is in some of the format work, the explanatory journalism, and I think audio and to a lesser extent maybe subscriptions as people feel a little bit more pride in independent journalism and start to appreciate what their contribution can mean in terms of supporting it.
Well, Armando, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it and love the work that you guys do.
Thank you.
Andrew, gonna throw it back to you to talk to Michelle.
Yep, sure thing. So I've got Michelle Prouse here, who's the VP of Strategic Planning at Buzzfeed. Michelle is I just said that she's a strategic planner at Buzzfeed, repeating myself, but she has been there for the past 2 years. She specializes both on strategy as well as looking at strategic insights. Prior to Buzzfeed, she has experience working on the agency side, so she can provide that perspective to this conversation, which I think is great. The first question I have for you, Michelle, first off, welcome, is just really around the response that Buzzfeed has had from a content creation perspective. I think when we chatted, you mentioned that there's been something like over 700 pieces of content that has been created by Buzzfeed thus far that has had some sort of a COVID theme attached to it, probably a lot of the utility type content and maybe some escapism for folks. What do you think that says about the appetite for that type of content, and what sort of insights and things have you seen come out of that kind of like scale that you've been able to achieve pretty quickly?
Hi everyone. I think it's around probably about 600.
Okay. We'll say 700. That's good.
700 pieces of content. So it's interesting because I think we've talked about this in the forum here, is it changes like week to week. And last week we saw a little dip in the COVID coverage or COVID content, and more of a spike in our non-COVID. And then this week it's a little bit, it's changed again, like a little tiny bit. Is it's a little bit more COVID and a little less non-COVID. So we're kind of like seeing these like little tiny bits of back and forth as you go along. And the best part about it is learning the human insights almost in real time. So there's all the data. And there's all the things that you get like 65% of X and 2/3 of blah, 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 and 1/3 of blah, blah, blah. But it's like really looking at seeing the sentiment and what people are talking about and seeing the consumption patterns. And I think that that's really what's interesting and kind of what we're leaning into at Buzzfeed. So we're seeing, stuff that we've always done well at doing well. Like Buzzfeed is known for identity kind of based content. And so our identity-based content is doing really great. So people are taking tons of quizzes. People are doing all the, cooking on, like learning what to do on Tasty. And all of that is like, still, it's like overperforming. It's all up, like everyone's traffic, like, up like 30, 40%. And then the COVID stuff, like there's Buzzfeed News and then there's BuzzFeed.com. Buzzfeed. And that kind of stuff we're seeing, it dips and goes ebbs and flows as people look to normalize, to deal with like restricted living, kind of like where they are in the pandemic, like what's kind of going on. And it really reflects the pandemic itself. Kind of, you can actually see that in the human behaviors.
Have you seen anything as far as like how different generations are responding to content? Gen Z versus millennials, so on and so forth.
Yes. So yes, short answer, yes.
Long answer.
Sure. Yes. Next question. No. So we just did some a poll with Gen Z, because we have a big Gen Z study that's ongoing right now, and they're really looking to escape, and they're looking for humor, and these are, depending where you are, these are the ones that are being homeschooled, and they're in high school, and so they're wondering when they're going to see their friends again, and so they're bored, so they're looking for what to watch, and you can kind of you see that, so you see that content kind of spike. But what I think is really interesting is they're also leading innovation and creation. So I never even heard of Zoom like 3 weeks ago. I didn't know what that was. And all of a sudden, we're seeing that pop up as like a thing of how people are kind of connecting. And that's a Gen Z brand. I think they were called Zoomers at one point. And it was based on that app. And to look at how they're leading, how we're going to communicate, and how this is kind of going to go forward. So it's really interesting to kind of see them step up as a creation forward kind of generation, if that makes sense. And millennials, I mean, oh my gosh, so the poor millennials. So you guys know about
Those poor millennials.
Poor millennials. Oh my God, they're like, guys, it's so hard, and look at all the things we've lived through. It's amazing. But they're like, can you believe it's another recession? We're never going to get out of our parents' houses. This is going to be the worst. But they are, so the whole boomer, millennial versus Z kind of memes and kind of conversation that was kind of happening prior to pandemic is really spiked during pandemic. It's like, look what you're doing, you bunch of hoarders, look what you're doing. Can you believe you're booking travel during this? It's like the generations kind of call each other out on how they're behaving, and that whole generation shaming, I think, is still happening, and we're seeing it on Buzzfeed a lot, and it's kind of humorous as well as insightful. And I think the insight from there is, if you want to take it up a notch beyond the fun content itself, is to kind of look at generations that are born in scarcity, and those were born in a time of abundance. So when you look at like boomers and X, they're born in a time of abundance. And so their natural behaviors are to hoard and to do things when things become scarce. It's just a natural kind of thing.
Is that the key to the toilet paper issue?
Yeah, like it's a natural instinct, right? Like it's like a thing when you're born in abundance, and then all of a sudden there's scarcity. When you look at younger millennials and see born in a time of scarcity, and scarcity I mean like time, attention, money, like those kinds of things, you learn to innovate, and you become more creative with it. And you can really, really see those polarizations within the groups based on some of the content.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about kind of the utility focus of content and how do you provide people tools. Like when we chatted earlier, we talked a little bit about like emotional utility versus functional utility, which is basically like, like what can consumers expect from a brand, and like how do we live our everyday lives versus like the bigger promise. Like when you guys are thinking about content that you're going to be, putting out there for brands, like how do you navigate that, or how do you approach that?
So when we talk about like functional, I guess, versus emotional, I'll tell you right now, there's no difference. Consumers don't know that. That lives on a brand plan or brand opinion or whatever it is that that you're doing in your campaigns. It's all emotional. Everything, if you want people to do something, they have to feel something. Everything is emotional. And you know how you know this? Look at delivery right now. If you can't get a delivery date that's a functional benefit. If you can't get a delivery date for 2 weeks for your groceries, that becomes highly, highly emotional. And so it's so there really isn't a difference between the two. And I'm not shocked that utility came to the forefront, because whether that's in pandemic or in the future, that should always be a thing. It should always be brands and service. I think the days of like brands as icons or rock stars is not a thing anymore. Brands have to think of themselves as like waiters. Like, hi, I'm here to take your order. What is it? And like kind of figuring that out. And when you're looking at, how you're going to talk about how they're going to speak during COVID right now or in the recovery period, it always has to be like, you have to kind of remember, you have to always be people first. And a lot of brands forget that. You think you are, but you're really about your brand message first, but it has to go the other way. You have to be thinking about like, what are these hurdles that my consumer is going through that I have to help overcome? What is that? You know, we talk about Coke and brands donating. I think Coke gave a big donation. But they're also a big hurdle they've seen is, you know, people wanting to understand the truth of what's going on. How do I navigate fake news or, you know, the false information? And they're turning over their social channels to experts. So they're using their platform to help say, okay, let's put out, you know, the truth of what's going on so people have a place to go. And that's a hurdle. And they're like, you know, and you see that service, and it seems really small, but it is like a massive emotional yet functional, because it's like basically facts and truth that's all kind of coming together. So what is that hurdle? What are you trying to overcome? And then that's how you have to figure it out. What's the consumer problem that you're trying to fix right now?
Yeah, I know. I think it's wise. Like we all, as marketers, have to, you know, put our consumer hat on, as we did with that poll, and kind of again think of like what would I want to receive, which makes a lot of sense. I'm going to go and switch gears here, and we're going to go from Buzzfeed to Forbes. It's like different ends of the spectrum. It's great. Our next guest is Janet Haas. She is the SVP of Strategic Partnerships at Forbes. In this role, Janet develops ongoing strategic partnerships with brands and provides best-in-class marketing solutions across Forbes' various channels. She's a frequent speaker at the global industry events, including Social Media Week, Advertising Week, Women in Media, Tech Talk LA, and others. Welcome, Janet, to the forum. How are you doing today?
So I'm good. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me. This has been great.
Thank you for joining. My first question is kind of piggybacks on what Michelle was just talking about, as far as this idea of like brand voice and how can brands be authentic with what they're doing. What have you seen resonating with Forbes audiences that brands can use kind of as thought starters as they're thinking about their strategy and where they fit in, and kind of going back to the swim lanes question earlier of like, where do they fit in within this world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that we work on every day. I mean, we've had our brand content platform for 10 years, and we've worked with so many great brands over the years, and working with them to really craft those authentic stories and messages that they were using before the crisis, and now helping talk with them about how to lead with purpose in this current crisis. And one of the things that we're doing is, you know, that there's that real natural magic that happens when a brand's when their strongest best practice aligns with a publisher like Forbes or like many of the other brands on the call today. And in doing so, you create that content that's very native to that brand. So one of the things that we've been doing at Forbes is looking at our larger newsroom for inspiration and ideas and trends and data and metrics to help guide our brand partners. So first, our newsroom and all of our content contributors and staffers, they had to really adjust to the incredible information needs that we were seeing from our audience about how to lead teams in new ways, how to leverage virtual tools, how, if you're a small business owner or if you're leading business transformation at an enterprise, how do you do that? So we've been doing ongoing analysis of those top headlines that are really resonating with key audiences at Forbes, like C-suite executives, IT executives, high net worth individuals, millennials, you know, depending on the right audiences. And we're really bringing those back to our brand partners, and we're having those conversations with them, and we're sharing those insights to help their newsrooms as they're evolving their edit calendars. And David, you made a really interesting point earlier, and that is about how messages are changing from when we were leading up to the crisis to the early days. Here we are in week 4. We're seeing different trends, macro trends that have impact for business. So brands need to have the insight to be able to think through their thought leadership that they're publishing with Forbes, that they're publishing on their own owned and operated sites. So we're spending a lot of time with our partners, and you know, if they are serving small business communities, if they're serving enterprise communities, we're looking within and we're really identifying the trends and really having those conversations. And I think there was some really great discussions today about how do you mention COVID? How do you find that authentic voice? Should all of the content be about COVID? Is there fatigue? And those are the conversations that we're having. Each brand has its own unique perspective and thought leadership platform, and we're there. Our content team's amazing. We're there to help them have those conversations and navigate, so again, they can lead with purpose and impact those global business audiences.
Yeah, and I know when we spoke, we talked about, kind of one of the things that's unique to Forbes is you have this platform where you've got Forbes Brand Voice, which is much more about the syndication of a brand's owned content and owned voice, which again, everything that we see is the owned teams are working around the clock right now to push out more content. And that's a way of getting content, more eyeballs on that content. Then you also have more of your custom content machine on your side where you're going on creating content for brands. Like, do you see much like learnings that are coming from the brand voice side and then being translated to like the bigger, more custom side content programs that you guys are creating?
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing amazing, like our brand voice platform is so great because it really does let brands share their thought leadership directly. And there's a ton of learning there about themes that are resonating and about areas that are really great for a deeper dive. Like I think there's a lot of conversation around AI, both for businesses and customer experience and all of those things that are really important to all of us, but also AI as a tool to help fight global pandemics. Mm-hmm. So I think that the brand voice platform is really interesting to use as a framework to really find out where those themes are resonating and have those conversations about, all right, let's take a deeper dive. Let's do some research. Let's provide more insights into this particular vertical topic for brands. And then we're able to quickly pivot and do that in visually engaging ways that are very complementary to the content, and also leverage social and other ways to get that important content out there.
Yeah. And then I think also unique to the B2B space is there's just some things that kind of continue on. I think when we were talking about digital transformation as, a thing that brands are focused on, whether it be AI or ML or all the other buzzwords that you can imagine. What do you think the balance is between a brand that wants to continue getting their core marketing message out about how they're trying to move or shift their priorities or their vision for the future, how to move that forward, and balancing that? Do you try to incorporate what's happening now into that message? Do you just kind of stay steady with that message? Like, what do you think is the optimal combination there?
Well, I do think it's a balance. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really dependent on what area the brand is in. I think if you're in, let's say, your brand helps small businesses, you need to lean really hard into that because it's such an important economic driver. And I think that this conversation about utility, I think people, especially small businesses, we see it every day, they're really looking for solutions to lead. So I think in that case, it's really doubled down on that and make sure that you're providing those tools and insights for small business leaders. For others, I do think, and we talk with our team, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach. But I do think that it's important, and especially to be mindful of the calendar too. I mean, everything is date stamped that we're publishing. So we need to be mindful of what message you're driving when you're publishing that. So I think it is finding that balance between acknowledging what's going on, because it's striking the right tone, but also you can err on the side of omission. As well. So if you omit, or if you use the wrong, like off photography even, that can be really not, that content may not be as well received. So I think it's individual, and we see brands doing a mix of, this very helpful strategic content, but then also continuing to, if it's a tech topic or B2B, to continue to lead, but within the framework of everything that's really going on, like today, this week, and we're going to see. And I think, again, paying attention to those dates when we're publishing what we're talking about is going to be really important.
Yeah, no, it's very insightful. And thank you for joining us. And
Thank
that
you.
last comment's actually a good segue, because I know something Ben wants to talk about at the end here. And this is actually a question that came in through the chat, which is around, how do you think brands need to be thinking about planning from 3, 6, 12, 24 months out, because everything's are changing. So I'm going to pass it over to David. And I know Ben wants to talk about that. Just quick housekeeping things, as Ben is our last speaker. A few things we're going to pop up in the chat right now for all of those who are listening in. So first and foremost is a link to a resource center that we put together here at Knotch. We're going to have all of these different links to webinars, ability to register, some research that we have. So please check it out. Again, just a resource for everyone to have access to. Second of all, we are doing another roundtable discussion on Thursday. This one's going to feature CMOs as well as chief brand officers. And we've got folks from a pretty diverse group. So it's AT&T, Bain, Citi, Oracle, PwC, Petco, Ford, and I think I'm missing one in there, but another one. So that'll be great. And then the final one is a link to one of our Knotch feedback modules. So we'd love to hear, how everyone found this. Was it useful? We really value the feedback. Please let us know. We want to continue doing these and making sure they're as useful and valuable to all the folks out there as possible. So I'm going to say thank you to the speakers. I'm going to pass it over to David, who will round out things with Ben.
Thanks, Ben. So, Ben, you have shown the ultimate in patience. Going last here, thank you. So you and I know each other and have for a few years now. So Ben James, for those that don't know, he's the New York Times first head of creative. You oversee creative editorial design teams across the T brand studio. Before this, you were at J. Walter as their chief creative officer in New York City. You've been recognized at Cannes. You've been recognized by Time Magazine's Best Invention list, the MTV Music Awards, Sundance Film Festival, all that kind of stuff. First, before we get to planning short-term and long-term, which is going to be the second question, is there anything we've missed in the past 85 minutes that you think is important for the listeners to hear about brands participating with content advertising, creative messaging during this time, and working with publishers?
It's a great question, and thanks for having me on. If anything we missed, or I actually would like to return to the beginning, and then just the talk of community that came up. I think that people are really needing a sense of community. I mean, we've been thinking a lot about, normally in situations like this, we're being asked as a community to be brought together. And this is a situation where we've been asked to spread apart. And what's really great is that we get to have a community like this where we get to come together and, just be transparent and open about things that we're doing. We're seeing very much the same as like themes that are, repeated across this. What we're seeing in our reader polls and data is, people are really interested in understanding what they want to hear from brands right now at the rate of like 70%. And I think on a normal day, that would probably be high. And what they want to know is how they're treating their employees, what they're doing for the small business community, and their virtual offerings, which I think speaks to community. And I think that there's so much of that right now that's important. And I just really appreciated hearing from everyone else that sense of things. And I just want to return to that theme. Yeah.
Well, it's funny when I saw that piece of research that Mindshare had done about community, it was really interesting to me because it's not something that kind of comes to your mind first and foremost about, 70% of consumers really think it takes the community to help solve this problem, but it's absolutely true. And brands are a part of that, and they're a part of their lives. So those that really talk about how they're helping to solve this in their own community with their own employees, just like you say, it can make a real tangible impact. And it's very true and authentic and sincere, which I think is really, really important. So the second question, when brands, so many brands are pausing their media, pushing their media, or going dark and just, looking at the back half of the year, how do you plan when you're like, what do we do now? There's not the influx of brands calling. People are tentative or fearful or just very, very cautious. So how do you plan short-term and long-term from the publisher side when you're in this situation?
From our end, we're thinking a lot about guiding brands on creative strategies, creative vision and voice, as well as creative production. But it's in that creative vision and voice category that I think this is a time to lean on creativity and really get a sense, start to think about what is the short, medium, and long term going to be. There was a great opinion piece in the Times from this last weekend that covered not just when are we going to return to the new normal, but when are we going to return to the new semi-normal? What are we going to do whenever, things are coming back in these waves? The good news there on the creative end of things is that we need great human insight to actually operate from in order to, create something. And right now we're shifting human insights and seeing, new kinds of human behavior every single day. So I think we have to lean on what we have been saying as an industry for some time, which is putting people first. And we have to lean on these things that we've talked about for some time, authenticity. We have to lean on these things that we've talked about for some time, brand purpose, and really actually engage those things. And I heard that theme come up across things. I don't underestimate the shift in the industry that's gone on like over the last several years, that's moved from putting the brand first to the connections we make to then thinking about the people, to putting people first, thinking about the connections we need to make, and then going where the people are. Going where have the brand show up for them. We've been preparing for a moment like this. We didn't know that this would be the moment, but great brands ultimately can endure in this, and I guess I'll leave it at this, is like I have a pretty big sense of what branded content and storytelling could be. I was asked once, what is my favorite piece of branded content? It's the Chrysler building. That's a piece of branded content to me. That's a story there. Happened in the late 20s, just as, we were headed into the Depression. And I think that we've seen time and time again, brands endure in this. Snap, Crackle, and Pop came out of the Depression era as well in that time. There's a lot that's going to be a lot of really creative work to be done that's ahead of us, and for brands to step up and really do that work of putting people first. So a lot of road ahead.
And one last question, because I know we're running a little bit over, so we really appreciate people hanging for another just 1 or 2 minutes. How has the Times been able to help in telling these kind of real human stories, authentic conversations? Is there something over the past few weeks that you're really proud of, or that you're working on now?
The thing that I think I'm proudest of was announced yesterday, is that the Times, in collaboration with Verizon, has made subscriptions to all high school students in America completely available for the next 3 months. So New York Times, Verizon, seeking truth, helping people understand the world, great connection, being able to make that available to all high school students across America. And I know that there's a lot of parents out there that are in need. I meet with many of them on Zoom and Google Hangouts lately who could use that help. And that's a moment that we announced yesterday that we're quite proud of that work and that partnership.
I think that's great. I think that hits on empathy, utility, and a donation of type. So you hit all the boxes, and it's obviously going to make an impact, which is great. Thank you so much for participating, and good to see you, my friend. It's been a little bit. Andrew, I'll kick it back to you to finish up.
Yeah, for sure. I think this has been great. I know we're a little over. I'm going to do one kind of rapid fire question. If people want to chime in, they can, and then we'll wrap it up from there. But a question came in is, what do you think could be a permanent legacy of COVID-19 when it comes to trust in brands? And I think this is something that we touched on a little bit, where people are thinking about the brand promise a little bit more. And so curious what people think the legacy would be, when it comes to this brand consumer relationship. Anyone have a thought they'd like to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think this is so different than it was in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, because we didn't have content like this, brand content. So I think the lasting legacy is going to just be trust and consistency. And I think brands, the the data that David shared earlier, I think it just really speaks to that we see brands emerge as thought leaders. They have incredible perspective to share with audiences. And I just think the brands that really find a way to do this and lead with purpose are going to be the ones that are going to have that lasting legacy of trust and engagement with consumers in all the right ways.
I think it'll vary for every brand. You know, I think every brand has to ask itself what it wants to be remembered for right now. But I think maybe one of the biggest sort of kind of macro imprints that will be left is the extent to which brands sort of acted as public servants. I think it's been really impressive to see a lot of brands step into roles, manufacturing roles, providing relief, shifting their entire production capabilities to provide the medical supplies that are otherwise lacking. That's been incredibly impressive and very disruptive for them, but very much needed. So I think to match sort of the weight that the public sector is putting behind those relief efforts is a thing that I think will help people realize the role that brands can truly play.
Yeah, Michelle?
I would just say we're gonna see the continued rise of the human brand. So human brands becoming and realizing that their attributes or whatever they stand for needs to be very, very human in an authentic way. And this connection and these resilient communities and I guess to say the same word again, connection that we're forging right now, I think will allow for a lot of growth, and I think they'll come out ahead. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think with that, we shall wrap it up. I just want to thank everyone again for joining. I think obviously we've been talking about brands and branded content and marketing and all these things, but I don't want it to be lost that you guys all represent amazing journalistic outlets. And at the end of the day, you know, brand marketing helps support those endeavors. And so it's a super important time to keep those efforts going and be really strong there. So thank you to all of your colleagues on the newsroom side of things for doing the work that they're doing. And thank you for joining us today. I think it was really helpful for the audience and very helpful for me as well. So David, any parting words?
No, it was a great conversation, and I hope everybody who participated as well as was on the panel felt so as well. But thank you all for your time, because I know it's a crazy time. So I would just say stay safe, stay healthy, and you know, thank you.
We'll see you on the other side, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, audience. Bye-bye.
Bye.